Hello everyone, welcome to Deep Sight. The relationship between Britain and France has been confusing for thousands of years. In the past few videos, we have introduced the history of the birth and development of Britain and France in the Middle Ages in detail. Today, let us further reveal what happened to them later. This is a famous large-scale war in European history, the 100 Years' War between England and France. It lasted for 116 years and not only profoundly changed the historical process of Britain and France, but also had a profound impact on the politics, society, and culture of the whole of Europe. Let's start from the beginning and analyze and interpret this history in detail for you. The causes of the 100 Years' War between England and France involved many complex factors, including disputes over succession to the throne, feudal and territorial conflicts, economic and trade interests, etc. The story begins in 1328, when Charles IV, the last king of the Cape d'An dynasty of France, died without leaving a male heir. The French nobles faced a difficult choice: who would inherit the throne? They finally chose Philip VI, a member of the Valois family. However, King Edward III of England was later dissatisfied with this decision and launched a war against France. Why? The most important inducement was that Edward III's mother was Charles IV's biological sister, and he believed that he had the most right to inherit the throne of France. What was the relationship between Philip VI and Edward III that led to such a conflict between the two sides? Let us explain it to you in detail. Philip VI was the grandson of Philip III, and his father was Charles of Valois, who was the son of Philip III and the brother of Charles IV, who inherited the throne. Edward III was the great-grandson of Philip III, one generation younger than Philip VI. His mother was Isabella, who was the daughter of Philip IV, and Philip IV was the sister of Charles IV, the son of Philip III, who inherited the throne. Therefore, Philip VI and Edward III were cousins within 3 generations. Specifically, Philip VI was the cousin of Charles IV, the uncle of Edward III. In other words, Philip VI and Edward III were cousins. Philip VI was the cousin of Edward III's mother Isabella. The marriage relationship between the royal families of European countries has in fact penetrated almost every country. We will further interpret the changes in relations between countries brought about by this complex relationship in subsequent videos. Edward III's grandfather Philip IV is an important figure in history. He is also known as Philip the Fair or Philippe le Bel because of his handsome appearance. According to historical records, he has an impressive physique and calm facial beauty. French Bishop Bernard Cessay once described him as follows: "He is neither a man nor an animal. He is a statue." This appearance was considered the most ideal image of a king at the time. His handsome appearance formed a sharp contrast with his strict and authoritarian character. During his reign, although he was known for his iron fist, his appearance earned him the title of Beautiful Man. Philip IV was born in 1268 and inherited the throne at the age of 17 in 1285. He married the plump but plain-looking Queen Juana I of Navarre, thus incorporating Navarre and Champagne into the French royal territory. Philip passed on his excellent genes perfectly to the next generation. His daughter Isabella was called Isabella of France. Her appearance inherited the characteristics of her father, not her mother. Isabella was slender and had delicate skin. Geoffrey of Paris even described her as the most beautiful woman in all of France, which should not be just flattery. All the brothers in their family were recognized as handsome men. Philip was not a handsome and weak person. On the contrary, he was a political strongman who was committed to strengthening centralization, suppressing the power of feudal lords, and expanding the royal territory through war and diplomacy. His ruling methods were considered cold and autocratic. Philip IV had a fierce conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, mainly because he imposed taxes on the Catholic Church in France and used it to attack other Christian countries. He also tried Bernardes, the Bishop of Bamiers, for treason, and these actions caused serious conflicts with the Pope. In 1309, Philip IV forced Pope Clement V to move the Holy See to Avignon, France, starting the Avignon Holy See period that lasted about 70 years. This move actually made the Holy See under the control of the King of France for a long time. Due to financial pressure, Philip IV declared the Knights Templar a heresy in 1312 and brutally persecuted and executed its members. This action allowed him to confiscate the Knights Templars' huge property. In his later years, Philip IV encountered the scandal of his 3 daughters-in-law being accused of adultery, suffered a stroke while hunting, and died on November 29, 314 at the age of 46. After the death of Philip IV, his 3 sons successively inherited the throne of France. Perhaps God is always unfair, giving their family too many looks and not leaving a long life. Several of his sons were short-lived, first of all his eldest son Louis X, who succeeded to the throne after Philip IV died in 1314. During the reign of Louis X, he tried to continue his father's policies, but his reign was short-lived and he died in 1316. After the death of Louis X, since his son John I was only an infant, his younger brother Philip V became regent. John died soon after, and Philip V officially became king. Philip V made some important legal reforms during his reign, but he died in 322 without leaving a male heir. Later, Charles IV, the 3rd son of Philip IV, succeeded to the throne. Charles' reign was also short-lived. He died in 1328 without leaving a male heir, and Isabella of France became the king's only remaining bloodline. The crisis broke out. The reason why French politics chose Philip VI instead of Edward III to inherit the throne was mainly based on the provisions of the Salic Law, which stipulated that women and their descendants could not inherit the throne. After the death of Charles IV, his closest relative was his nephew Edward III, the King of England at the time, but unfortunately this bloodline was inherited from his mother. According to the Salic Law, the legitimacy of his succession to the throne was questioned. Salic Law, or Lex Salica, is an important code of law that has been in use in Western Europe since the Middle Ages. It originated from the customary law of the Salic tribe of the Franks. This code was originally compiled by the Frankish king Clovis in the early 6th century AD and became the basis of the laws of the later Charlemagne Empire. Salic law mainly includes criminal law and procedural law, which specifies in detail the compensation for various crimes, especially the compensation for personal injury, property damage, theft, and insult. In addition, 1/3 of the compensation received by the victim needs to be paid to the royal family. In terms of civil law, the most famous provision in Salic law is to restrict women's inheritance rights, especially prohibiting female descendants from inheriting land. This provision later evolved into a comprehensive deprivation of women's inheritance rights, which had a profound impact on medieval and modern European history. It is worth mentioning that some European countries still have a political tradition that women have no right to inherit the throne and hereditary titles. When the male descendants of the family are extinct, the situation of allowing women to inherit is called semi-Salic law. Salic law eventually became one of the causes of the 100 Years' War between England and France hundreds of years later. In this context, the French nobles and dignitaries prefer to choose Philip to inherit the throne, because they believe that this can keep the French throne among the nobles of their own country. They certainly do not want Edward, who is far away in the British Isles, to go to France to become the new king, which is bound to conflict with their core interests. Philip VI was the closest male descendant of the Salic law in terms of blood relationship. He grew up in this noble environment and had a huge power base, so he was supported by everyone and regarded as the legitimate heir. According to the law at that time, after the dynasty was extinct, the 3-level conference should elect a new king from the great nobles. Therefore, the 3-level conference elected Philip as the King of France. In the end, Philip VI was crowned as the King of France and founded the Valois dynasty. Why was Edward III so strong-willed that he had to challenge the Salic law that had been passed down for hundreds of years? This should start with Edward III's growth experience. His father was Edward II. Edward II was the King of England. His reign was full of various problems in history. He was also the first king in British history to be deposed. Edward II's marriage relationship was quite complicated and controversial. He married Isabella of France in 1308. Isabella was not a simple woman. This marriage was originally intended to strengthen the alliance between England and France. During Edward II's reign, his preference for favorites caused dissatisfaction among the nobles. His particular preference for Piers Gaveston and later, the Despensers led to strong opposition and political turmoil among the nobles. These favorites were considered to have excessive influence on the king and were even accused of having improper relationships with the king. The growth of their power and influence, as well as their behavior in politics and economics, made them enemies of the nobles and Queen Isabella. His rule was also considered weak, especially in the military campaigns against Scotland, which were repeatedly defeated, most notably by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The influence of these favorites and Edward II's preference for them were more generally considered to be a major problem in his marriage. By 1325, Isabella ran away from home in anger because of her dissatisfaction with the Despensers and returned to her mother's home in France, where she became the mistress of another handsome man exiled by Edward II, the young nobleman Roger Mortimer. What happened next was very inspiring. In 1326, Isabella's brother, King Charles IV of France, decided to seek justice for his sister who had been treated unfairly. He fully supported Isabella and Mortimer in leading the armed forces of the exiled nobles to invade England. In the end, this coup led to Edward II being forced to abdicate in 1327. He was placed under house arrest at Buckley Castle in South Wales and died mysteriously alone in the same year. There are many legends about the cause of his death, but it is generally believed that he was assassinated. Edward III was born on November 13, 1312 at Windsor Castle in Berkshire, England. He also spent most of his early years at Windsor Castle, which had an important influence on his growth. Windsor Castle is not only an important residence of the British royal family, but also a center of political and military activities. Edward III received the education and training of the future king here, laying the foundation for his future rule. Edward III ascended the throne in January 1327 and became King of England after his mother's coup. He was only 15 years old that year. His reign was in stark contrast to his father's. He was considered a powerful monarch in English history and was known for his military success and restoration of royal authority. His reign lasted 50 years until his death in 1377. The era of Edward III witnessed major developments in England's military, political, and cultural fields, especially the evolution of the English Parliament and the ravages of the Black Death. The second year after Edward ascended the throne, his uncle Charles died. Such a strong king had objections to decisions such as the Salic Act. Although the Salic Act did stipulate that women and those through female lines could not inherit the throne, Edward III believed that he was the son of Isabella, the sister of King Charles IV of France, in the closest blood relationship, and was the legitimate heir. The loophole in the Salic Act was that it was originally a law on land inheritance, and was later cited in its implementation as a legal basis for women not to inherit the throne. Based on this, Edward believed that he had the right to inherit the throne. Edward's dissatisfaction also reflected the power struggles and political competitions among the European royal families at that time. His dissatisfaction and demands were more aimed at expanding his power and influence. This reflected the complex political environment at that time and Edward's personal ambitions. This war was definitely not just a dispute over personal interest between the kings, otherwise it would be difficult to get the support and full participation of the nobles on both sides. In addition to the issue of succession to the throne, there are long-standing territorial disputes between Britain and France, which are directly related to the political and economic interests of both sides. For example, the English royal family owns a large territory in the Duchy of Aquitaine in southern France, but as a vassal of France, the King of England must swear allegiance to the King of France. This complex feudal relationship has caused contradictions and conflicts between the two sides. Imagine that the English lords in Aquitaine have to be loyal to the King of France and maintain their interests as English subjects. This dual identity has brought endless conflicts and troubles. The King of France hopes to weaken England's influence in France and consolidate his rule, while England hopes to retain and expand its territory in France. The economic interests of Britain and France were also a key factor in the outbreak of the war at that time. England's wool is an important raw material for the European textile industry, while French wine is an indispensable part of the lives of English nobles and citizens. France hopes to weaken its influence in Europe by attacking England's economic foundation through war. The conflict of economic interests made the war between the two countries inevitable. In fact, Edward III did not immediately claim the French throne after Charles's death. At this time, He was only 16 years old and was still consolidating the political structure of England. This timeline is an important historical verification. Charles IV died in 1328, and Edward III did not officially declare himself the King of France until he turned 25 in 1337. Before this, Edward III's claim to the French throne was not clear, and he mainly tried to resolve territorial disputes with France through diplomatic means. But this request was rejected by the French Estates General and Philip VI, who had become king. Edward III used this as an excuse to launch a war against France in 1337, 9 years later. Edward III's mother Isabella supported her son's claim to the French throne. However, the French rejected this claim and insisted that she could not transfer rights that she did not have to her son. The war broke out. The 100 Years' War between England and France was one of the longest wars in history. It can be roughly divided into three main stages: the initial stage, the intermission, and the later stage. Each phase has its own unique story and key events. The early stages of the war were marked by England's remarkable victories. In 1340, at the Battle of Sluis, the English fleet defeated the French fleet at sea, securing control of the English Channel. This victory enabled England to safely transport its troops to France. In 1346, the English army won a decisive victory at the Battle of Crécy. The English army took advantage of the longbowmen and defeated the numerically superior French army. In 1347, after the victory at the Battle of Crécy, the English army besieged and captured the strategic city of Calais. Calais became an important stronghold for England and France. In 1360, the two sides signed the Treaty of Bretigny, temporarily stopping the war. The treaty stipulated that France ceded large areas of territory to England, including Calais and Aquitaine, in exchange for England giving up its claim to the French throne. One of the main leaders of the early 100 Years' War between England and France was Edward the Black Prince, whose full name was Edward of Woodstock. He was the eldest son of Edward III and Philippa, and was famous for his bravery on the battlefield, especially his victories at the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Poitiers. His nickname, the Black Prince, came from the black armor he wore and also because of his cruel rule over Aquitaine. Edward died on June 8, 1376, of dysentery. His death occurred before his father, Edward III, so he did not inherit the throne. His second son, Richard II, eventually succeeded Edward III to the throne. Edward the Black Prince was buried in Canterbury Cathedral. The second phase of the entire war lasted another 50 years, which is the intermission, 1360 to 1415. This period, although nominally bound by treaties, did not completely stop hostilities between the two sides. In 1369, King Charles V of France, feeling humiliated, launched a counterattack against English territory. He successfully recovered many of the lands occupied by England in more than 10 years. During this period, both England and France experienced serious internal turmoil. The Peasant Revolt of 1381 broke out in England, while France suffered from the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. In the late stage of the 100 Years' War between England and France, both sides had long lost the interest of the kings in fighting for power. This stage lasted for nearly 40 years from 1415 to 1453, and this period was also the time when the Turkish Empire in the East rose. The war in the later stage began with the victory of King Henry V of England. In the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, the English army once again took advantage of the longbowmen and defeated the French army. Henry's victory once again strengthened England's influence in France. In 1420, Henry V and King Charles VI of France signed the Treaty of Troyes, stipulating that Henry V would marry Charles' daughter Catherine and become the heir to the French throne. Unfortunately, Henry V and Charles VI died in a short period of time, making this closer peace treaty impossible to achieve. History always makes people play tricks on people. If this strategy had been implemented, Britain and France might be one country today. The major countries in the world today might also speak French. The turning point of the fate of the Anglo-French War came in 1429, when a young farm girl claimed to be guided by God and began to inspire the French army. God bless France. This is the famous Joan of Arc in history, also known as Jeanne d'Arc, who was a national hero and Catholic saint in France. Joan of Arc was born in Domremy, a rural area in France in 1412. Her family owned about 50 acres of land and ran a farm. Joan of Arc grew up in an isolated area loyal to the French royal family, and most of the surrounding territories were occupied by Burgundians. At the age of 13, Joan of Arc claimed to have met the angels Saint Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine under a big tree behind the village, from which she received God's revelation, requiring her to lead troops to recover the lost French territory occupied by the English at that time. After several twists and turns, Joan of Arc gained the trust and military power of the Crown Prince Charles. In 1429, the 17-year-old Joan of Arc successfully lifted the siege of Orleans and immediately became a female national hero known throughout France. She then led the French army to defeat the English invaders many times and prompted Charles VII, who had the right to inherit the throne, to be crowned king in Reims Cathedral on July 16th of the same year. Unfortunately, Joan of Arc was captured by the Duchy of Burgundy in a small-scale conflict battle in Compiègne in 1430. She was then bought by the English for a large sum of money and tried by the Inquisition under the control of the English authorities. Joan of Arc's trial process was full of controversy. She was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and wearing men's clothing. During the trial, Joan of Arc faced a series of complex and often trap-filled questions. Although she insisted on her beliefs and innocence, she was eventually found guilty. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was tied to the stake in Rouen, France, and her young life was devoured by the raging flames. She was nearly 19 years old. In the flames, she called out the name of Jesus many times. Far from changing the situation of the war, Joan's death became the beginning of her legendary story, and the people of France were awakened and began to fight. France continued to counterattack under the leadership of Charles VII. By 1453, France had almost completely recovered the territory occupied by England. The Battle of Castillon that year marked the last major battle of the war, and France won a decisive victory. Joan's mother and other supporters worked hard to vindicate her, and finally in 1456, Pope Calidus III ordered a retrial of Joan's case and vindicated her. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc. Joan's story and sacrifice inspired countless people, and her name and image became a cultural symbol of France and even the world. The 100 Years' War ended with a French victory. In 1453, England only retained the small enclave of Calais until it was also recovered by France in 1558. This long war had a profound impact on both countries and other parts of Europe. Let's first talk about the impact on Britain. The war promoted the development of the British Parliament. Since the war required a lot of money, the King of England had to frequently convene Parliament, especially the House of Commons, to approve taxes. This enhanced the role of Parliament in state affairs and laid the foundation for the establishment of the British parliamentary system later. The war also accelerated the decline of the feudal system in England. A large number of nobles died or went bankrupt in the war, resulting in the redistribution of land and the gradual formation of a more centralized and efficient agricultural management model. At the same time, the high cost of the war and the loss of land forced England to carry out economic reforms and innovations. Let's talk about the impact on France. After the war, France's centralization was strengthened. The long-term war destroyed the power of many local nobles and strengthened the king's control over the country. Charles VII and his successor Louis XI carried out large-scale administrative and military reforms, which gradually led France to the prototype of a modern country. During the war, especially under the leadership of Joan of Arc, France's national consciousness was significantly enhanced. The French began to identify themselves more as a nation-state, rather than just relying on local lords or the royal family. This awakening of national consciousness is of great significance to the historical development of France. The 100 Years' War witnessed a major shift in the way war was fought in the Middle Ages. The use of longbowmen in England, the introduction of artillery, and improved tactics all marked the end of the traditional era of knights. Wars became more dependent on infantry and artillery, laying the foundation for modern warfare. The war also changed the political landscape of Europe. France's victory greatly enhanced its position in Europe, while England gradually turned its attention to domestic affairs and maritime expansion. In addition, during the 100 Years' War, the Duchy of Burgundy once became an independent political force, but with the end of the war, Burgundy was reintegrated by France. The political landscape of Europe changed significantly after the war, and the power comparison and diplomatic relations of various countries were also readjusted. The Hundred Years' War had a profound impact on the evolution of the political system of modern European countries. In England, the war promoted the development of parliament and the checks and balances of monarchical power, and ultimately promoted the formation of modern democratic systems. In France, the war strengthened centralization, prompted the monarchy to move towards absolutism, and laid the foundation for the construction of modern countries. The political systems and governance models of many modern European countries can be traced back to changes in this period. The continuation of the war led to the adjustment and development of the economic structures of the two countries. In England, the war prompted a change in agricultural production methods and promoted the development of early capitalism. In France, post-war recovery and reconstruction also promoted economic modernization, especially reforms in administration and taxation systems. The war had a profound impact on the fiscal and economic policies of both countries and promoted the modernization of society and economy. According to different statistics, the death toll in the Hundred Years' War is estimated to be between 2 million and 4 million. Among them, the death toll in Britain was about 1 million to 1.5 million, while the death toll in France was about 1.5 million to 2 million. These figures include soldiers, civilians, and prisoners. Many people died from swords and artillery fire in battle, and many others died from disease, hunger, and abuse. In addition, due to the long-term and persistent nature of the war, many people also died from long-term malnutrition and hardship. In short, the Hundred Years' War between England and France is a major event with far-reaching influence in European history. It is a disaster for ordinary people. It not only changed the political, economic, and social structure of England and France, but also had an important impact on the historical process of Europe as a whole. From disputes over succession to the throne to the rise of nation-states, from the end of medieval warfare to the budding of modern military technology, the legacy of the Hundred Years' War still affects the world today in many ways. The people eventually rose up in the French Revolution a few hundred years later and sent the King and Queen of France to the guillotine. Dear viewers, by studying the Hundred Years' War in depth, we can not only better understand the historical process of Europe, but also draw lessons and experience from it to provide reference for solving the complex problems facing the world today. This is the content of our historical exploration in this issue. We will reveal more historical stories for you in the next episode. I am Lawrence, your time travel navigator. By learning from people, we can understand gains and losses. By learning from history, we can know the rise and fall. Let us see the distant past and foresee a bright future. Thank you for watching and accompanying us. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell to get more exciting content about history. See you next time.